Hi, this is Connor, and today I'm here to do a back to basics review of Aperture. Aperture is the opening on your lens, and the number that you see next to it is a measurement of how wide open the lens is. The number, also called an f-stop, is actually the ratio of the diameter of the opening to the focal length of the lens. I'm going to show you here with my all-manual lens that the larger number for the f-stop, the smaller the opening, and the lower the number of the f-stop, the wider the opening. So right now you see this is at f22, so there's a very small opening. But as I slowly open up this lens all the way to its maximum aperture of f1.4, it gets a lot wider. So that's the first thing to know. When you're looking at your camera and you see if you're in manual mode or A mode, which stands for aperture priority, the number that you're changing is the f-stop of the lens, so you control how wide the opening is and how much light gets into the camera. Aperture is one of the key components of exposing your picture because it allows for more light to get into your camera per unit of time. So not to be confused with the shutter speed, which is how long your camera is exposing for, the aperture is how much light your camera is letting in during that shutter speed, roughly, based on the opening of the lens. However, there are some trade-offs. If you're using a really wide aperture, which remember means you have a very low number next to your f-stop, you're going to have a very shallow depth of field. This means that very little in frame is going to have a sharp in-focus appearance. As you'll notice now, this tree is in focus when I'm not, because Roman is using a shallower aperture, or a wider aperture, which results in a shallow depth of field. Depth of field itself is defined as a plane that is parallel to the face of the sensor. So if this is the camera sensor right here, this is going to be the depth of field, and you move it back and forth when you focus, but notice that it's a parallel plane unless you're using a tilt-shift lens. The way that your lens changes the aperture is by moving the diaphragm in the lens. The diaphragm is blades that are on the inside of your lens that will change the diameter of the circle. As you see, as I stop down the lens to smaller apertures, the blades come in, and they don't make a perfect circle anymore. This is why your out of focus bits will stop looking as clean and rounded and start looking sharp. That's why you will have not so nice bokeh at higher aperture values unless you have a lens with a many bladed diaphragm. That is roughly 9 blades or higher. The other thing to note is that when you stop down your lens, because of the properties of glass and light traveling through small holes, you'll actually get a sharper image. For most lenses, peak sharpness is at f of 8 or f of 11. However, if you're using a very wide prime lens, such as the 50-1.8 or this Rokinon 85mm f1.4, your peak sharpness could actually be at f of 4. So it's important that you research your aperture values for your lens that you're using so you can maintain a peak sharpness. So you might have heard me talking about bokeh earlier when we were discussing depth of field and the number of blades in your diaphragm. Bokeh is a Japanese word for light, and it is the quality of the out-of-focus parts of the picture. Now, when you are using a very wide aperture, you're going to have a smoother bokeh in the background because the subjects will be further away from the plane of focus that the depth of field encompasses. Different lenses are going to have different qualities of bokeh based on the construction of the lens, the glass used, and the number of blades in the diaphragm. When you have highlights in bokeh, they can sometimes turn into circles or some polygons depending on how stopped down you are in the lens and how many diaphragm blades there are. Basically, the highlights will start to look like the opening of the lens. So if I have 8 blades in my diaphragm on this 50mm f1.8, as I stop my lens down, these bokeh highlight points are going to start to look like octagons, whereas if they're at 1.8, where this lens's diaphragm is wide open, it's just a circle, the bokeh is going to be perfectly circular. Bokeh can be pleasing, but it's also important to make sure that your subject is entirely in focus in frame, or your picture won't look as good, and the out of focus bits can just be distracting. In these example pictures, notice that as the f-stop gets larger, or meaning that the aperture and opening is smaller, more is in focus, and the bokeh becomes less and less soft and less pleasing. In summary, the aperture of your lens is how wide open the diaphragm is. It determines how much light will be let into your camera for every unit of time. The wider your aperture, the lower your f-stop number will be, and the shallower your depth of field will be. This can lead to some pleasing bokeh, but it is important to make sure that when you're using a wide open lens, all that you want in focus is in focus.